This film is dedicated to my father, Frank Cullen, and my mother, Margaret Cullen, and to all the people who always leave a light on.
The Truth Must Dazzle Gradually by my daughter Helen Cullen.
And from the record player, through the crackling, Henry Mancini's orchestra began to play. The opening notes of Moon River, at once so familiar and yet newly revelatory, broke through the cracks, and with them came the light.
Inishoig, 2005. It was Christmas Eve.
Murta wore tan sheepskin slippers, broken down at the heel. He shuffled to and fro along the well-worn floorboards in the shadowy hallway of the Moon family home. Smoothing unwieldy fair hair back from his forehead, he gently touched where his temples throbbed. Still damp from the rain, he hugged his cardigan tighter, and the wooden robin brooch on his lapel turned upside down.
The ticking of his wristwatch was amplified in the silence, its pearlescent moon face catching the streetlight through the window and winking back. The door to the living room remained firmly closed. Christmas waited inside.
The branches of a lopsided fir tree, the one he had dragged home across the Gallagher's field 7 days before, were weighed down by decades of tinfoil garlands the children had clumsily stitched together with red wool. None would ever be thrown away, however tattered they became. Every year, as the moons assembled to transform their island cottage into something akin to Santa's grotto, each child claimed their own creations with jealous possession.
With ceremonial grace, their mother carefully unrolled their handiwork from the fraying white tissue paper that protected it for the other 48 weeks of the year. One by one, the decorations were placed on the tree. Over these festivities, as with all others, Murta's wife reigned supreme. His Queen Maeve.
None of the children challenged the traditions. Their mother had sewn them so meticulously into the fabric of their being, stitches that could not be outgrown.
How he loved her for this gift she bestowed upon the family. Permission to remain childlike in their enthusiasms, never to become embarrassed by what they had once loved. You never have to lose anything or anyone, she often said, if you just change the way you look at them.
And yet he had lost her, even while he held her close, even with his eyes wide open.
Murta had woken that morning once again to an empty bed. The sheets were cool and unruffled on Maeve's side. He had expected to find her sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in her houndstooth shawl, pale and thin in the darkness before dawn. A tangle of blue-black hair swept across her high forehead like a crow's wet wing, her long matted curls secured in a knot at the nape of her neck with one of her red pencils.
He had anticipated the way she would start when he appeared in the doorway, how he would ignore, as he always did, the few moments it would take for her dove-grey eyes to turn their focus outward, for the ghost to leave her in his presence. The kettle would hiss and spit on the stove as he stood behind her wicker chair and rubbed warmth back into her arms, his voice jolly as he gently scolded her for lack of sleep and feigned nonchalance as to its cause.
But Maeve wasn't sitting at the kitchen table, nor was she meditating on the stone step of the back door, drinking milk straight from the glass bottle it was delivered in.
She wasn't dozing on the living room sofa, the television on, but silent. An empty crystal tumbler tucked inside the pocket of her peacock blue silk dressing gown, the one on which she had painstakingly embroidered a murmuration of starlings in the finest silver thread. Instead, there was an empty space on the banister where her coat should have been hanging. Myrta opened the front door and flinched at a swarm of spitting raindrops. The blistering wind mocked the threadbare cotton of his pyjamas. He bent his head into the onslaught and pushed forward, dragging the heavy scarlet door behind him. The brass knocker clanged against the wood. He flinched, hoping it had not woken the children.
Shivering, he picked a root in his slippers around the muddy puddles spreading across the cobblestone pathway. Leaning over the wrought iron gate that separated their own familiar island from the winding lane of the island proper, he scanned the dark horizon for a glimpse of Maeve in the faraway glow of a street lamp.
In the distance, the sea and sky had melted into one anthracite mist, each indiscernible from the other. Sheep huddled together for comfort in Patter Oaks Field, the waterlogged green that bordered the moon's land to the right. The plaintive baying of the animals sounded mournful. Myrta nodded at them. There was no sight of Maeve.
As he turned back towards the house, he noticed Nollaig watching him from her bedroom window. The eldest daughter, she always seemed to witness the moments her parents had believed, hoped, were cloaked in invisibility, and then remained haunted by what she had seen.
Ever since she was a toddler, Myrta had monitored how her understanding grew, filling her up, and knew it would soon flood her eyes, always so questioning, permanently. He waved at her as he blew back up the pathway. Later he would feel the acute pain, finally recognising the prescience his daughter seemed to have absorbed from the womb.
How long is she gone? Nollaig was now standing before the hallway mirror, her face contorted as she vigorously tried to wrangle her frizzy mouse-brown hair into shape. She scraped it together in a tight ponytail that thrust from the back of her head as if it were a fox's brush.
"Och, you should leave your gorgeous curls be now," her father cajoled, "instead of fighting them." She smiled at him but slammed the mother-of-pearl hairbrush down on the sideboard. "I don't have curls, I have Brillo pads," she sighed. Did she say where she was going? Myrta squeezed his daughter's arm as he continued into the kitchen. "I'm sure your mother's just out for a walk. Happy birthday, love. Lo brella hana ditch."
He placed a small copper saucepan of water on the range to boil and waved the imitation of an egg at his daughter. She nodded begrudgingly and curled into the green and gold striped armchair that sat in front of the stove. "With your white nightdress, you could almost pass for the Irish flag," he joked, and was gratified with her snort of glee.
He watched the clock hand count 3 minutes in silence, expected any moment to hear his soaked wife splash through the door. He was poised, ready to run towards her, with a towel and hushed reprimands for her careless wandering. But the boiling, cooling, cupping, cracking and spooning of each egg passed uninterrupted.
Nollaig yawned, stretching her arms and legs before her in a stiff salute. "Why don't you go back to bed for an hour?" Myrta asked. "We'll all have proper breakfast together later." She eyed him with suspicion, but acquiesced. "If Mam's not back soon," she said, sidling away, "come and wake me. Promise? We'll go out and find her. Remind her what day it is, for God's sake." Myrta nodded, ushered his daughter out of the kitchen, and watched her climb the stairs.
Born on Christmas Eve, Nollaig was the only one of their children who came into the world by a Galway maternity hospital, and not into the impatient arms of Moira ní Dooley, the midwife of the island. She resented it, how it made her feel less of a true islander.
What was more, the specialness of her own day for individual attention, her birthday, was irrevocably lost in the shared excitement of Christmas.
In retrospect, it had been a mistake perhaps naming her Nollaig the Irish for Christmas, and further compounding the association. No nickname had ever stuck, however. She wasn't the sort of child who inspired others to claim her for their own, with the intimacy of a given name. Born ancient, her little sister Sive always said of her, with bored disdain.
Nollaig carried the weight of being the eldest with pained perseverance.
heavy responsibilities that were self-imposed. Her mother harboured a not always silent resentment of it, and it seemed only natural, if unfair, that Maeve and Sive gravitated more towards each other. The baby of the family shared her mother's wit and wildness, and often expressed the irritation her mother tried to hide at Nulloch's sense of duty.
As soon as he heard Nulloch's room grow still, Murtagh pulled on waterproof fishing trousers over his pyjama bottoms and Wellington boots. He struggled into a heavy jumper of itchy grey wool, impatiently yanking the sleeves of his nightshirt down from where they were caught at the elbows, and shrugged on the duffel coat that remained his favourite, though long past its prime.
It was 8 in the morning now. The sun would not rise until close to 9. As he reached into the cupboard under the stairs for a torch, he was relieved to find only one waiting on the shelf. At least she's taken a light.
The beam from his flashlight showed him little but the safest path for his own feet, but he was glad of it as he waded through the inky blackness.
Come, meet me, Maeve, show yourself. Come, meet me, Maeve, show yourself.
As he marched to beat down the long narrow lane towards the pier, trailing his left hand along the stony walls covered in moss, he repeated his mantra. Not another soul stirred.
What would call them from the warmth of their homes to be drenched in this storm?
When the weather enveloped the island in an angry embrace such as this, the isolation became almost unbearable. The elements made prisoners of the islanders, who could be convinced they had been swept out to sea, lost and untethered, never to reach the mainland again.
As Murtagh leaned against the weather-bleached clapboard sign that shouted fairy times in bright orange paint, the sky became diluted with the first strata of light. The rain eased. The darkness slunk away, but only by as little as it had to for dawn to be officially considered broken.
Perhaps Maeve was already at home. She in turn now worried for him.
In the weak winter light, he trudged through the sand to retrace his steps, willing with each breath for his home to have sprung to life while he'd been gone.
The sound of the twins arguing in the kitchen heartened him as he wiped his boots on the back door mat. 18 now, they occasionally loomed before him as fully grown men. At other times, they were still the small boys who hadn't liked sharing the same supermarket trolley seat and let their objections be known.
How hard is it to make toast, Mossy? Dylan said, scraping the charred surface of a cremated slice of soda bread into the sink. Every single time. He enunciated each syllable with a violent scratch of the butter knife. Mossy, indifferent, stood drinking orange juice straight from the carton, ignoring the rivulets that dribbled down his chin. His face lit up as his father peered around the door. Da, where were you? What's the story with breakfast? He shoved the carton back in the fridge, its lid discarded on the countertop.
Yeah, Dylan chimed in. Where's the feast that Mam promised? We're half starved waiting. Murty swiveled his head around the kitchen. She's not back then. Your mother. The twins caught each other's eyes before their gaze fell back on their father as he wrestled off his boots. Was she not with you? Mossy asked, dragging his floppy fringe across his forehead and plastering it behind his ear.
Sunday, his mother called him. Tomás Moon, the pale, blonde, waifish bookworm who inherited not only his paternal grandfather's name, but his colouring and temperament too. Son Knight, his brother Dylan, with ebony black curls and high cheekbones, was unmistakably his mother's son.
Named in honour of her two heroes, Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas, the artistic mantle lay heavily on his shoulders. He had the dream to be an artist, but not the driven determination. Dylan was never interested in struggling, only in enjoying what came easily. Mossy was the one who worked hard, persevered conscientiously with any task until it was complete. Sometimes Myrta wondered how each would have developed if their names had been swapped at birth, or if, with the naming, their fates had been sealed.
Nolik reappeared in the kitchen, dressed now in the white velvet pinafore and red polo neck her mother had bought her to wear on Christmas Day. "Has Mam not resurfaced?" she asked, her face flushing. Murta absorbed the questioning expressions of his 3 children and shook his head. "I'd better wake Sive," said Nolik, and pounded back upstairs.
Sive had turned 16 that summer and relished her new, more mature-sounding number. Obsessed with the Manic Street Preachers' Suede and Placebo, she wore fandom like a uniform. A jet black bob curled under her chalk white painted face like the Lego hair of the figures she played with as a child. Eyeliner rimmed her eyes in rivers of coal black, the same dove-grey eyes she saw mirrored in her mother. Blood-red lipstick emphasized how little she smiled, although the melancholy music elated her. She revelled in the secret world inside her headphones and fantasized about escaping to London.
Discovering her musical tribe had made her feel less alone, more optimistic for future connections, romance, and inspiration. For now, she advertised for her ilk through her clothes, usually striped, always sooty black, battleship grey, or midnight blue, that she wore in layer upon layer with garlands of silver stars draped around her throat. A full-length, fake leopard print fur, salvaged from a charity shop on Eyre Street in Galway City, was her most prized possession.
It was this she wore over her nightdress now, as she reluctantly followed Nullig into the kitchen. She pulled the coat tighter around herself upon detecting the tense cloud that lingered in the air, observing the private smoke signals her brothers passed from one to the other. Her father was busily burning sausages in the pan. She was surprised to hear him curse when the sizzling oil spat at him.
"So what's the plan? Is Christmas cancelled then?" Sive asked, checking the temperature of the coffee pot with the palm of her hand. Marta poured her a mugful and scoffed. "Don't be daft. We're going to have a little fortification, and then perhaps we can all take a stroll and go and meet your mother. She's lost track of time, that's all." Sive reached for the mug, and they both held it for a moment. "So, search party, that's what you're saying. Great." She slumped in a chair at the kitchen table and elbowed Mossy to give her more room. Her father turned back to the hob, his voice strained. "That's not funny, Si, and it's nothing of the sort. I just think we'd all like to start the day together, and you know your mum. She'll be having a great time walking the roads and will be delighted to see one of us coming to meet her." He put the ham that Maeve had prepared the night before in the oven and set the timer for noon.
Not long afterwards, as the rain started again to pour, the twins forged ahead towards the rusty shipwreck on the east of the island. Nullig and Sive elected to walk past the chapel onto Tigned's pub and agreed to then carry on to the castle ruins if they hadn't found her first.
Myrta set out for the lighthouse, convinced if Maeve was gone this long, that must be the road she had taken, although, the thought struck him, he did not know how long it had been since she left the house.
Why hadn't he insisted she come to bed with him? She was too restless, she said, too full of the moon for sleeping.
After they reached their destinations, they would reconvene back at the house instead of continuing on. The chances were their mother would be waiting at home when they came back, wondering where they had all gallivanted off to.
Nullig and Sive returned empty-hearted first. Nullig scraped the ashes from the grate in the living room, then Sive set the kindling for a fire. They stood in front of the mantelpiece in silence, waiting for the others, warming their hands near the flames without feeling the heat at all.
The twins burst in next, drenched. Dylan's fluorescent trainer squelching as he walked.
When they saw the sisters were alone, they backed out of the living room without a word.
Mossy climbed back under his duvet, fully clothed, his brown brogues dangling over the foot of the bed, and pretended to read a book of poetry by Keats. Dylan drained a tank of hot water in the shower, his discarded clothes a steaming pile outside the bathroom door.
When Myrta's arrival wasn't accompanied by the fluttering sing-song of their mother's voice, Saib's eyes flooded. Nullig snapped, told her to pull herself together and hurried towards the kitchen to speak to their father alone. The aroma of roasting ham percolated throughout the silent house as if in spite. When the electric beeps heralded its readiness, Nullig turned off the oven without even looking inside. She hoped her mother would be home soon to reprimand her for not taking greater care. Dinner was sacrificed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in, as her father prepared to face the elements once again.
Nullig called her brothers and sister together, and they divided up the island paths between them for a second search. Nobody spoke as they marched out of their cottage in single file, back into the storm.
Minutes of acute expectation bled into hours of increasing anxiety. By mid-afternoon, Myrta and his 4 children were wet, exhausted, and turning on each other.
In vain, their father encouraged them to eat bowls of lukewarm vegetable soup that he ladled out slowly. He choked his own down, spilling some on his cardigan, dropping his spoon on the floor tiles with a clatter. Nullig caught his eye and he nodded. "We need more help," he said, as he eased himself up from the chair. "I won't be long."
Myrta walked to Teagned's, where the islanders were gathering before evening mass for hot whiskies and shepherd's pies, amidst the owner's begrudged festive decorations. A lime-coloured plastic Christmas tree on the windowsill wore a Galway jersey and was circled by pint glasses holding beeswax candles donated by the parish priest, Father Donal.
The RTE Guide Bumper Christmas Edition stood on display by its side with a small laminated sign perched against it. Not to be removed from the premises. The air was heavy and moist as a result of the condensation rising from damp clothes and human bodies huddled together.
Myrta spoke to Father Donal, whose white denim jacket sat stark against his black shirt and slacks, a sprig of holly pinned to his breast pocket. With head tosses and clicking fingers, Donal summoned a semicircle of islanders before draining his tumbler in one, crunching an ice cube with his back teeth as he delivered his instructions.
The Moon children will come to the pub, eat some dinner there, no objections entertained. Myrta himself was to wait at home for Maeve.
In case, Father Donal said, before correcting himself. I mean, for when Maeve comes back by herself. In groups of 2s and 3s they dispersed, half-consumed pints of Guinness left resting on the grill in the hope of a speedy return. And so Myrtle found himself pacing the floorboards of the hallway, fingering the rosary beads in the pocket of his cardigan, out of superstition more than faith.
What little light had broken through that day had once again dissolved into darkness.
Through the small window in the hallway, he watched the street lamps flicker into life in quick succession as the cuckoo clock chirped 4 with inconsiderate glee. He shouted at it to stop and then found himself apologising to the little yellow bird.
A knock pounded the front door. Murtaugh hid in the study for a moment, covering his ears.
He didn't want the news a knock like that would bring. What he wanted was a hand to reach for that door that belonged to someone who could unlock it, walk herself in, and wrap her arms around him.
He blessed himself with the ruby red beads and opened the front door a crack. Father Donal stood on the doorstep, his denim jacket soaked through, his hands wringing a tweed peak cap. Over the priest's shoulder, Myrtle saw Seamus McCann and Anya O'Connor waiting outside the gate, huddled under a huge canopied umbrella advertising Tato crisps, their eyes focused on the laneway beneath their feet. "Why don't they come in, Donal?" Myrtle opened the door wide and beckoned them with his arm, but the priest reached for it and held it in his own.
"Tell me, Myrta, your currick. It's still in the boatyard. When did you last have her out?" Myrta took a step back. The priest a step forward, still holding his arm. Only yesterday. Sure, where else would it be? No one would be out in this weather. No one. What are you asking me that for? He shook himself and stood up straighter. Donal squeezed Myrta's arm tighter, his frozen fingers exposed in black, fingerless gloves. There's a curragh caught in the rocks by the westward cliff. A few fellas are climbing down now to release it. Could you come with me, Myrta? Just so we know it's not yours. To eliminate it.
Myrta shook away the priest's hand and pushed past him without stopping for his coat. Donal hesitated before pulling the door closed behind them and following Myrta up the path, his hands clasped together.
Myrta threw his shoulders back as he repeated his walk from that morning to the pier. His name designated him protector of the sea, and now he pleaded with the Melanoid Atlantic for his own protection. Father Donal, Seamus and Anya rushed behind him in silence, but no one tried to match his step.
At the boathouse, he found the door unlatched, and the discovery stuck the soles of his boots to the sandy ground. Anya stepped forward and gently swung the door wide and pulled the string to light the bulb that dangled from the ceiling. With a glance, she quickly knew what Myrta's eyes would not believe, however hard they scanned and searched. The boat was gone.
From the distance, Myrta heard voices calling from the shore. Ignoring protestations from the priest to wait until he had learned more, he staggered down to the sand dunes to where a cluster of men stood in a half-moon around the curragh, their hunched shoulders turned away from him. As he approached, Pater Og, owner of the whining sheep, moved towards him. His clothes were saturated, his face red, raw and freezing, eyes wild.
I'm sorry, Myrta, he croaked. It's Maeve. We have her. She was tethered to the curragh by a rope. Her pockets. His voice broke. Her pockets were full of stones. He stood aside, and Myrta dropped on his knees in the wet sand beside the boat.
In the silver light, blue veins traced delicate pathways across Maeve's face, like tiny cracks in a porcelain vase. He traced a line over each one with his little finger, while the islanders turned their faces away.
Father Donal began a decade of the Rosary, and, in quiet voices, each person joined in, even the ones who weren't believers.
In fact, theirs were the loudest voices of all. As with each Amen, the darkness crept closer.